Hello everyone, this is Music. A bit ago, I made a 7 levels of boy bands, mainly from the pop lens, and I want to do the same for girl groups. And yet again, I'm stating this from a pop lens. I'm most likely going to do one for the R&B girl groups, but they have different criteria. So I'm not going to compare the pop groups to the R&B groups under the same criteria. So pretty much I'm going to rank and talk about some notable girl groups that fit in each of the 7 categories. I'm going to go through each of the 7 categories once we get to the categories, but I'm not basing it on just on commercial success. Their commercial window I am taking into consideration, but groups in general don't have the longest commercial windows anyways. Their success in singles and albums definitely are going to be considered. You can't just ignore it because they determine whether you have an audience, whether people know your music. So that is going to be a factor. Whether that music is still remembered decades and years after the heyday and they become established, or the legacies become established, that's going to be considered. So pretty much the digital footprint over the generations. Regional versus global fame is definitely going to be taken into consideration as well. Their influence on other girl groups, that's a huge part because that shows direct influence, direct connections, and it shows how well your legacy holds up. So that's definitely going to be taken into consideration. The influence could be through their image, through them writing their own songs or writing in ways that their girl groups before them or the predecessors before them did, what the groups represented, the messages that they put out there, all that will be taken into consideration when I am ranking these groups. So I kind of explained it here. Hopefully, it makes sense. So I'm going to start with level 1, and I call this the developmental slash obscure tier. So these are groups that were either developing, like before they were really getting pushed out there, where they're in that developmental period where they get signed, but they're not really catching on, or they're testing the waters with them, or they're just groups that are really, 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 really niche slash local, or had like virtually no commercial success. Really, they have an extremely small footprint to the point where it's damn near invisible, minimal to no mainstream penetration. Not really remembered by really anyone. They might have some underground or regional importance or relevance, or they're kind of like a prototypical element, or they're kind of on that status, maybe. So these could also be groups that had like a hit or so, but they faded very quickly, and the cultural footprint is not small. These could even be like pioneering girl groups, so like the girl groups of like the 40s and 50s and 60s that maybe had like a hit or so, but they faded, and their legacy hasn't carried on to future generations too. So groups that fit this are James Academy. This is before they became the group that they are now, as it was a reality show that was about them creating a group, but nothing has been solidified yet. Nobody's Angels. They were not together long. They didn't really have success. The Toys, they were pioneers, kind of. They had like a hit or so, but then they faded, and their legacy doesn't translate to, or and didn't translate to future generations. Yes, the same thing with MO. They're not really the biggest group, so these are just general examples. It is possible to get out of a level 1. Dreams Academy is the prime example of that, with them eventually becoming Cat's Eye, and the leftovers are starting to form other groups, if I'm reading into it correctly. Two prime examples of groups that got out of level 1 are Girls' Time, which became Destiny's Child. For years, they didn't have any success. They had a record deal before getting signed, and they struggled for a lot of the 90s. And the Supremes pre 1964, some may say pre 1963, where they are deemed the no hit Supremes or the hitless Supremes at Motown because they were given song after song after song after song for like a good 3 to 4 years, but nothing really stuck. They were in level 1 for many years, but then obviously they blew up and they got out of that. So these are just prime examples. Now we are going into level two, and I call this the limited breakthrough. So these are groups that had flashes of very modest visibility, but never had sustained momentum or built sustained major consistency, really, or momentum. So they might have a moderate era or a moderate hit, very brief media presence during the time of their so-called imperial phase, if you could even call it that, and in future generations. So the digital and generational footprint. They generally had weak infrastructure and a weak rollout. They are often disrupted by label issues or trends. When it comes to the categories, their peak visibility was on the lower end. Their success was extremely short lived, even for groups. Their recall value is very low, and there's definitely some missed potential factor when it comes to them. So that's kind of how I see this grouping, or this tier or level. So a lot of these groups aren't fully obscure. Some, actually, many of them had real industry backing, though very inconsistent, had some charitable respectability. They had fan bases, some influenced niche scenes, or became critical slash fandom favorites, but they never became or consolidated into major historical institutions, broad nostalgia staples, or canonized cultural forces. So the group survived through gene memory, internet rediscovery, critic choices, dedicated nostalgia communities, music respect or musician respect, and scene specific importance rather than broad public permanence. And that is the difference. So their recognition is very fragmented, demographic specific, and fandom dependent. And this is based on a pop level, or a pop lens, my bad. Okay, so I'm not going to go into much detail on these groups, and I'm not going to do the sub tiers here because we have way too many levels before we really get into it deeply. But there are some groups that I want to briefly talk about that are examples of this. So we have groups like Haim, who are pretty much kind of niche. They're respected musicians, they have a lot of admiration, and they have strong critical support. But when you look at their pop embedment and their mass cultural saturation, it is extremely limited, especially when it comes to the monocultural penetration, mythic imagery, and fewer universally recognizable songs. But they do have a lot of indie rock credibility. Total is definitely a group that's going to be a lot higher once I do the R&B groups. But when you look at them, they're very tied to the bad boy era identity and to the late 90s. But when it comes to them solely, they are overshadowed by bigger artists of their era. They lack the mainstream mythology or really the recognition of mainstream, and their cross generational transfer is extremely weak. I am going to include R&B group Jade as well. They fit a lot of the similar pros and cons that Total face. They were successful, but limited crossover appeal, and they were overshadowed by many bigger artists, and they didn't have the pop islands or the international artists compared to many of the others, and their generational footprint is pretty weak. I'm going to include groups or bands like M2M and Stussy. They did have some sort of success, but it was extremely brief and it really doesn't compare to most of the others on the list, and their generational and digital footprint is extremely weak. So I also have some older borderline OG groups like the Chantels and the Marvelettes, where they did have some success, but their hit making streak was a lot more inconsistent compared to the groups of their era and their historical foundation act. So if I were to pretty much create another tier or sub tier, this would be it. They helped create the foundation of girl group history, but modern public awareness faded dramatically. They have weak modern visibility. low streaming era survival, low digital footprint, low cross-generational footprint, and limited current cultural functionality. So pretty much they're historically important groups that nobody remembers anymore. A lot of that definitely has to do with their labels and the imaging and the marketing that unfortunately has them here despite their contributions, though it isn't anywhere near compared to their peers of the same era. Alrighty, now we are currently at level 3, and this is the point where I'm going to get a bit more detailed when it comes to the groups that I talk about. So, pretty much with level 3, the one thing that I do want to kind of establish is that they are girl groups that are remembered, but there are limits to it. So, there are real pop history, or there is real pop history in here, and these acts are not fringe acts. They generally had legitimate hits, strong visibility at one point, notable fan bases, a recognizable enough branding, and maybe some cultural moments, but that part's generally lacking a bit. But the thing with them in general is that, on average, they are historically bounded. They mattered, sometimes a lot, but not enough to become permanent institutions when you think of girl groups or the history of girl groups or the most iconic or the most well known girl groups when it comes to their digital footprint or generational footprint, especially. And as a crossover, meaning all walks of life, act from back then, and that still kind of carries over today when it comes to the legacy. And whether they're cross generational or not, some of these artists were definitely big at the time, but the cross generational canon is extremely weak. So they might be known for their group name, one or two songs, the aesthetic, or an era, but the memory usually stays generation specific, region specific, genre specific, or nostalgia specific. And I'm focusing specifically on the crossover element when it comes to this specific video. Okay, so I am going to split things up into tiers here, and at level 3A, I do have strong cult recognition. So before I get into anything else, they're not literally cult artists. Obviously, if they had the six that they had, they would be more than cult artists. You don't chart on a Billboard and have a strong era or two just on cults. That's not what I'm referring to. When I'm referring to strong cult recognition, I'm mainly referring to their overall impact, mainly being carried by a small demographic of people or a strong but minor fan base, especially as their Imperial era ended and what they remembered long after the era is completed. So the cross generational element. You don't really see them in the pop history books or them referenced like that. Even within the industry long after their prime, it's usually the hardcore people who solely focus on pop music who brings them up, remembers their impact, and they did have a run here and there. But they're not strong when it comes to their legacy, and it's very specific to one era, and they're not seen as one of the bigger girl groups, so it's kind of easy to just move on from them. I honestly thought about putting some of these groups into level 2, but they do have a bit more memorability and a bit of a stronger Imperial era and footprint compared to the ones in level 2, hence them being in level 3, but this is kind of the lower end of level 3. So the first group that I am mentioning here is Mystique. They definitely had success, but it was mainly in Europe from what I can see. They didn't chart very well in other areas in Europe, and their run was really like 2 years. So they definitely have more going for them than a level 2 artist, and they definitely had many hits in their region, though it only looked like one was a worldwide hit. But when it comes to the UK and a few other areas, they were definitely successful, so I'm not taking it from them. But when you think of the UK or European girl groups, they usually don't come up, and I definitely think that is due to not only just others being much bigger, but other groups having a bigger generational and digital footprint, having more iconic moments, and having a larger stronghold in regards to European girl groups. So it kind of has them being placed here. So the second group that I have here is TLW slash the Cheetah Girls. I kind of had to combine them because their awards are so tied to one another, and two members were in both. And you can't really talk about one without the other. 3LW on their own were really one era wonders. They're kind of coming up during the latter one of the girl group wave in the early 2000s, and they were younger. Two, obviously, the chicken incident is very referenced, and right when that group fell apart, the two other members got Cheat Girls, and they, while they weren't charting on Billboard, though I think that had to do with how Hollywood Records and Disney handled their artists. They had multi-platinum albums, they had successful soundtracks, they were touring, they were very successful in that regard, and they had a run until the late 2000s. So I definitely think that kind of bolstered both of them up. But when you think of girl groups, you don't really think of CLW or Cheetah Girls like that. They are also very era specific, and their generational footprint and the digital footprint and the cross appeal is just not very strong. They're very specific to the demographic that they were in, and they were very overshadowed as well. And the final group that I have here is 702. Obviously, if this was an R&B group, they would be higher. I don't know how much higher they would be, but they would definitely be higher. They only really had a few crossover hits. It really wasn't consistent. I believe them being on Motown during the mid to late 90s definitely hurt them because Motown didn't really know what they were doing. And especially with their first two eras, right when they had a crossover hit, the next single wouldn't do well, and it came off like it was the hit that was popular, not the group. There's a lack of consistency when it came to their marketing and branding and really establishing a stable, big fan base. And then when they came back in the early 2000s, things just kind of fell apart. Even when you compare them to the other R&B groups that were either a bit more consistent, had bigger R&B fan bases, or were more crossover in general, they just didn't really compare. And I think that's why I have them here compared to the other groups and why they're not in higher level 3 or even in the higher tiers. So that's all I have for these three right now. And now we are at 3B, which is what I like to call fan centered durability. So these are artists who definitely are a bit more consistent, especially compared to level 3A. They had a decent run at least, but they were never dominant in their era, or at least compared to their contemporaries. But a lot of these groups do have multiple hits, and they had a successful album or two. But when you think of crossover durability, they lack that compared to their peers. Some of these groups are a bit more R&B centered, while others are more pop centered, but it was either their they weren't worldwide like that, or it was mainly their hits that were more notable than their albums. But the thing that all five of them definitely have in common is that they're mainly carried by their fan bases. Today, you're not going to hear come up when you think of the best girl groups, or when the best girl groups are discussed, or the girl group songs or whatever. They're generally not going to come up. They don't really have that long lasting legacy that'll have them be remembered for generations upon generations to come. They don't have the iconic looks or the iconic moments compared to the girl groups that are above them. They are pretty much relatively successful, but their legacy today is mainly carried by their fan bases, and they're not that recognizable to the general public compared to other girl groups. So the lack of durability, essentially, despite them having success, that's generally why they're here, but they're more consistent than the level 3As. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so the first group that I have here is Danity Kane. They had a successful two albums, though things got very inconsistent for them at It was a big deal that their first two albums debuted at number one on the Billboard charts. They did have some hits. I definitely do give them credit, and it wasn't spread. It was a bit more spread out, so it wasn't all just in one era. I do give them that. I also think that them being on Making the Band, which was a huge reality show at the time, and it still has a lot of cultural relevance today, definitely boosted up their legacy compared to what it otherwise would have been. But when it comes to the stats, the longevity, the hits, the durability, and the imagery and all that, they just don't compare to the girl groups in the upper four tiers. That's why they're here. Escape. So obviously, if this was an R&B group list, they would be higher. It's still impressive that they're able to have all their albums go platinum. So they're a lot more consistent compared to many of the girl groups of their era, but when you look at it, they lack crossover appeal. They did have a few hits that did cross over, and it wasn't just all in one era. I think they had one crossover hit in each era, but it was never consistent when you look at their runs, and it didn't lead to album sales as the albums were mainly carried by the R&B fan base. And yeah, the R&B audience, and they didn't have crossover audiences when it comes to like other countries, especially compared to their R&B girl group peers, which is why I have them here. They're still recognized. Obviously, two of their members were later attached to reality TV, and they had a reality TV show themselves, Escape, which I definitely do think bolstered them up a bit. Hence why they're here. They're recognizable, but they're not notable when you think of girl groups. They're not going to be the first people that you mention, especially compared to the titans that are above them. Okay, so with Bewitched, they only released two albums, and from what I can see here, it was definitely very successful. Obviously, their biggest audience is the United Kingdom, and they were successful there. United Kingdom and Ireland, that was their main audience. They charted well in other countries too. Even one of their albums did well in the US. They definitely had some hits, especially in the regions, and but only two or three were like huge international hits. So they definitely had a run, but when you think of the UK groups or the UK girl groups, they're not going to be the first or the second ones you think of, and I don't think they have the same durability compared to most of the girl groups of their era when it comes to their recognizability now. Honestly, I could state the same thing for Wilson Phillips and Expose together. I really could put them together, especially since they did come up in the same era when you really look at it. But this was in the late 80s and early 90s. I guess for Expose, it's just the early. Sorry, for Wilson Phillips, it's just the early 90s. And I do think that era is a bit more forgotten compared to prior and future eras, so the durability of that era just isn't as strong. The cross generation appeal for that era isn't as strong. So I definitely do think it hurts both of those groups. Expose definitely had a lot more hits, and it ranged from a like a 5 to 6 year time frame, so they are more consistent. They have a bit more longevity in comparison, but they only have one platinum album, so things kind of tapered off. But when you look at their stats today, or the streaming numbers, or when girl groups come up, they never come up, despite them having a consistent run. So I definitely do think that they lacked that cross generational appeal, though I definitely do think part of it just had to do with when they came out. Expose, it's kind of the similar thing, but it seemed like most of their run and their hits came from one album, though their second album was a success. It didn't have the same amount of hits or longevity compared to it, and they had like a 2 to 3 year run. And I just think them coming out in the early 90s definitely bit them in the butt when it came to their durability and longevity due to the reasons that I already mentioned. Alrighty, so now we're at level 4, and obviously this is the middle of the pack and middle of levels essentially. So pretty much the thing with level 4 groups is that they're important enough to debate forever essentially because they do have some stats on them. So generally these groups are too historically significant for levels 1 to 3 but not secure enough for levels 5 to 7. So there is tension here and when it comes to where you place them because there's a lot of debate. So for level 4 groups, you could argue that they're underrated, they should be higher, their influence mattered a lot more than people admit, their peak was enormous, and history compresses their identity and they're run unfairly. What makes a level 4 group, at least in my opinion, is that they achieved either one or many of these things. So, a major commercial peak, substantial influence, regional domination, aesthetic innovation, historical symbolism, genre expansion. So, they can fit many of these, but on average, they usually fit one, maybe two of them. But compared to levels 5 to 7, they lack complete canonization, fully stable, cross generational permanence, and civilization level mythology. So there has to be some sort of allure and story about them, even way beyond their prime that has people interested in them. And obviously, the cross generational appeal is very important because that's how music and history carries over. So the thing with level 4 is that they are historically unavoidable, or they're too big to be unavoidable. Even though people could and do debate their exact importance, they can't be removed from the story. But at the same time, they're not pillars compared to the others. Okay, so now we are going to get into the sub tier. So the first one that I have is level 4A. This is the upper established. So these are groups that are very, very, very successful. They have notable eras, they have a notable look, they have recognition amongst the general public. But when you really, really, really look at them, they're not the most influential when it comes to the entire girl group scale. They are very successful and they are an example of how successful a girl group can be, and they can be notable within their eras, but when you think of the influence and being pillars of the girl groups, they're not just there. They're mainly just very, very, very successful. And I'm looking at this through a pop lens. There will be some groups who are lower on this end, but if I do an R&B video list, which I'm most likely going to do, they will be high. So just take that into account. These groups don't have a whole lot of daughters, if that makes sense. And you don't have a lot of people referencing them compared to, especially the top two tiers. I'm going to get into what level 5 is later and why they're kind of separate from the top two levels and even level 4. So it'll make sense once I break it down. Okay, so the first group that I have, and not only just this sub tier, but this tier overall, is Atomic Kitten. So they, as a group, were objectively huge during their run, especially in Europe. But their later historical memory shrank them somewhat. And history kind of reduced their emotional scale, and the emotional scale is very important. So when you look at them, they have major UK and European success, recognizable hits, and a strong early 2000s visibility. They definitely have multi-platinum eras, and they had a good run during the 3 years that they released albums, and they have huge, huge hits in Europe that are very, very notable. So that is definitely a positive for them. On the negative side, though, their innovation is relatively weak. They have a limited mythology, which kind of connects to the emotional scale, and they have less aesthetic permanence. When you think of UK groups, they are very successful, but they're not the most influential of the girl groups. And when you compare them to the broader scale of girl groups, they are a perfectly acceptable level 4 group. Okay, so the second group that I have here are All Saints, and a lot of what I said about Atomic Kitten definitely applies to them too. Their first era was humongous, where they even crossed over in the States with that era, which is very impressive since it's not something that is very common for UK groups. Obviously, they were humongous in Europe, and that is their main audience. Their second album did well, though not as well, and I do think they have a bit more endurance and durability than an Atomic Kitten. So they did survive historically throughout, and they, at least in comparison to some of the others, and they do have a coolness preservation, especially regarding their aura and their image. Aesthetically, they are very, 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 very known. They have that for them. At the same time, they're not at the top of the top when you think of girl groups. They're not the most influential. They're just the representation of a very successful girl group in the late 90s and early 2000s. Especially when you compare them to like a Spice Girls, the influence is not really there. They're just a very successful group who's one of the more notable European girl groups, which is still very impressive. And then the next group is the Pussycat Dolls. So they came in during a time where girl groups were on the decline, if not fully extinct, especially in the States as Destiny's Child themselves were closing up, and even a lot of the European girl groups weren't doing the best at the moment. So what they have for them are massive global hits that are still recognized today. Their branding and image is extremely recognizable and iconic and well known and unique. No one else has their aesthetic or their branding, even though it comes with a lot of controversy and kind of a bad stigma for them, but it is very notable, and that's what they have for them. Their identity is very much so based on dance and performance, even more than the other groups. They have major mid 2000 pop visibility, and people remember their songs, their visuals, and the era, even still 20 years later. But the weakness for them is they do suffer from the Nicole Scherzinger overshadow effect. The group mythology is relatively weak. Their tenure wasn't as long as it could have been, and due to the issues with how they were formatted, it does cause for a less stable and a weaker emotional nostalgia. So essentially, the stuff about them is more pretty much remembered fondly than the group identity itself, and that's kind of a huge problem that we're still seeing currently with what's going on with like their third or fourth iteration. And the final group that I have in the sub tier is SWV. If this was an R&B girl group list, they would most definitely be higher. But like I mentioned several times throughout the video, I'm looking at this through a mainstream pop and a worldwide lens. And based on that, I have SWV at level 4. Obviously, they had a lot of R&B success. I would say that their first album and era definitely had some crossover appeal to the pop side. Some of them even did decently outside of the States, which wasn't the most common for them. But when you compare them to an En Vogue or a TLC, their prominence and influence just does not compare at all. So that's why they're here. Are a very successful girl group. They are a notable girl group. They have successful eras even after their first, despite their first being their biggest. But their permeance, especially in a mainstream pop lens, is definitely very underrated and it's not as strong as the upper two tiers, which is why I placed them here from a mainstream pop worldwide lens. I'm noting that again because I know people are going to mention their R&B success, and when I eventually make that 7 levels of R&B girl groups, they are most likely be a lot higher. So now we are in level 4B, and I like to call this historically recognizable. So these are groups that could have easily been in level 6, but there's just something that was missing, and that's why they're in this tier of level 4. So these groups definitely have more of an argument for them compared to the ones in level 4A. They definitely do have a lot of success. They are historically recognized and remembered, specifically in their regions. Their names are important in the girl group scale. They may not be the most influential, but their name holds a lot of weight. And there's a lot of argument that they should be level 2, but one or two things was just missing, which is why they set up for a very, very successful group, even though they may not have the strongest permeance or image or just weight compared to the level 6 and 7 groups. So they're essentially the next level below those two tiers. Okay, so the first group that I have here are Girls Aloud. They are very, very, very important in the United Kingdom, and I believe Ireland too, if I'm remembering correctly. In these countries, they are borderline, if not level 6. That's how huge they are. They have longevity, so that is very impressive. So when it comes to strength, they have an elite UK singles catalog and run. The Xenomania production innovation is a big thing. They have strong British pop influence and critical respect, which is why they could be considered level 6. But the main weaknesses they have is that they do have a weaker US penetration, and even ignoring the US part, they have a lower worldwide embedment. So when you compare them to the heavyweight, especially the top of the British groups or European groups, they don't have the biggest reach, but they do have a bit more influence than the other European groups that I did mention, which is why I have them here. So their argument is pretty much regional canon versus global canon. So that's the main thing with them. Okay, so the next group that I have here are the Pointer Sisters. The interesting about them is that when it comes to the genre of music that they make, they are arguably, if not the most diverse girl group ever. Even compared to the groups that are in levels 1 and 2, they have covered arguably the most genres out of everyone, where they've done disco, pop, R&B, dance, country, jazz, and I'm sure I'm missing some more. They have a lot of longevity for a girl group as they had a lot of success in the 70s and the 80s. And this was during a period where girl groups were not very popular, so they're really holding it down there. They reinvented themselves several times, so, despite all of that, though, they are kind of underrated. They're not listed as the top of girl groups. People who do know them respect them, and their name still holds a lot of weight. They're seen as a very successful girl group, but they're not seen as the pillar or one of the pillars of girl groups. And I think it's the emotional resonance isn't the strongest with them, or the mythology with them isn't the strongest compared to some at the top. So that might have to do with it. But they're easily the prime for B artists where they could very easily move up to level 2 if they had just a bit more pizzazz to them when it comes to their cross generational influence and their image. But very talented, very important, just not level 6 or 7. So the final group that I have in not only just the sub tier but this level overall are the Emotions. So they were popular during the 70s, during a period where girl groups were not the most popular at all. Obviously, The Best of My Love is a pop standard at this point. It's a cultural phenomenon on its own. But even outside of that, they represent high-level R&B vocal harmony precision, a continuation of the black vocal group excellence traditions, but doing it in a way that fits the time period instead of just copying what the prior girl groups did. They are a direct link to Chicago soul and gospel rooted pop singing. They're heavily respected by musicians, producers, and R&B historians. The thing that doesn't have their higher is that they lack a strong visual slash iconic identity footprint. archetype creation in pop music, broad public mythology based on key songs, and structural influence on later girl group branding or girl groups in general are a bit weaker, which is why they are in this tier of level 4. And now we are in level 5. And this is a very, very, very interesting level. And it's the most interesting level because I call this level the Imperial Phase level. So pretty much these are people who are currently, as I am recording, are an active group. They are making hits, they are touring, they're in the current cultural zeitgeist, they are current mainstream artists, or they're trying to be current mainstream audience. They have an audience. Pretty much they are appealing to the music industry audience of the 15 to 25-year-olds today as I'm recording this. So this is their time to really build a legacy for themselves. They're trying to prove themselves. So pretty much their story is currently being written. And level 5 is fundamentally different from every other level because every other level, their story has been written, but that's not the case with level 5. Pretty much, that's the case because these groups are active historical processes. So their final legacy, their permanence, their influence, their decline, their nostalgia, durability, and their mythology are not fully settled in yet. So this makes level 5 the volatility tier. Though when you look into the two tiers, or when I break down the two tiers, you will definitely see the differences in them, pretty much. So they're either current or recent. We haven't seen how the legacy holds up throughout the generations, either because the Imperial phase just recently ended or it's ongoing. So pretty much the core identity of level 5 are groups that are currently either in Imperial phases, are in recent or had recent dominance periods, modern peak relevance, or active canon building stages. So for one of the tiers that I'm going to get into, they might not be in the Imperial phases, but their canon building stages is happening at this point. So this level exists because modern groups are ranked too early without a level 5. So an example, a group can appear gigantic now, culturally unavoidable, and commercially overwhelming, but later decline in history, or a currently active group may eventually become all-time canon. So we don't know where they are. So once their time ends, they can either be a level 6 or level 7, or they can even drop down to a level 4 or maybe a level 3. So that's how I am looking at it, and I hope that makes sense. So the key question for level 3 is, will this greatness stabilize historically? And that question defines the entire tier. So with level 5, I have two tiers. So the first one is active legacy. So these are ongoing systems. What this refers to are these are people who are currently releasing records, trying to gain hits, currently releasing albums to see how they react to them. They are trying to prove themselves because they are an active girl group in the current musical industry climate. So hopefully that makes sense for everyone. So the first group that I have here are Blackpink. So pretty much this is a K-pop group that has a lot of success. They have had some American success. They are huge worldwide. I will say out of the girl groups who are in this tier, they have the biggest chance of moving up to at least a level 2 once things are set and done. When it comes to their strengths, they have huge global visibility. They have luxury and fashion integration into their brand and image, so they're recognizable to that reach. The digital reach definitely helped them out, especially within this current social media climate. They have iconic member branding and strong worldwide recognition. So those are huge things that are in their favor, and they are very successful currently. So when it comes to their weaknesses, at this point in time, their discography is on the smaller side. There are a lot of questions and doubts about their musical depth. So whether they're going to mature in their music, whether they're going to branch out, cover different genres, have more depth in their music. And obviously, Their long-term nostalgia hasn't been tested yet, it's not proven. And pretty much the only thing that they are currently missing is time. We don't know where they're going to end up. They're still in their imperial phase. They're still an active girl group in the current musical industry climate. So we have to see how they end, and then obviously what they will be remembered by in the years after the imperial era ends, and to see whether they still hold up. But I feel like out of the groups that will be in this tier, at least, they have the best chance of moving up to at least a level 2. Okay, so the other group that I have here for an example of level 5A is Cat's Eye. So pretty much this group has major infrastructure and potential. You saw that from the show and how they've executed since the show. But history cannot evaluate them fully yet, or really at all yet. So with Cat's Eye, they have a globalized idol experiment that worked and paid off. Hype and Geffen are backing them up a lot, so that is good. They were positioned well when it comes to the transnational and the multilingual element because they're supposed to be a global girl group. That's the biggest thing about their appeal. And when it comes to their infrastructure, they are very, very high visibility, even in ways that doesn't really involve their music. That can be a positive and a negative. But the thing with them is that their legacy is unproven, their influence is unproven, their catalog is extremely underdeveloped. They haven't even released an effing album yet. So how big are you if you haven't released an album and we don't know how big the album really is? And they're currently going through a lot of drama right now that doesn't make them look good. And they're also known more for their brand deals than their music, which isn't good for groups. Um, and we don't know how long their fandom durability will really last. So overall, Cat's Eye could become hugely important, moderately important, or historically transitional. But the future remains open for them. We have to see them do a whole lot more. Best case scenario, they could be a level 6 or a level 7, but if things flame out from here, they'll probably be a level 3 or a level 4. So, depending on how they handle things, they could either rise to the top or drop flat. Okay, so now we are at level 5B. So, this sub-tier is what I like to call the completed modern legacy, i.e. closed systems. So with these groups, their imperial run ended, but it ended either recently or some years ago, but there hasn't been a new generation to really see how their legacy will be carried through. So these are groups who were popular within like the last decade or so, give or take. They're popular, and their run was when late millennials and Gen Z were the main musical audience. They had their run. They were the girl groups of those generations, and they have ended, but we don't know how history will remember them yet because they're still too recent to see how they hold up when it comes to the cross generational appeal, how their story holds up 20, 30 years later, and they haven't had time to really settle in their legacy yet to see how it holds up, to see whether they'll be as impactful as the girl groups that became stable decades before them, generations before them, to the point where they're in the upper 2 tiers, or whether they'll be in some of the lower tiers. So we don't know yet. That's why they are here. So I have two groups in this sub tier, and the first one is Little Mix. So pretty much they're in a very interesting and a precarious situation. So obviously Little Mix just exited active dominance, so they just ended their imperial run, but their legacy has not stabilized yet since it just ended like a few years ago. So things that are in their favor, they had massive UK success and that carried on into Europe and I think some places in Asia too. They have a strong vocal reputation. They lasted longer than most modern girl groups did when it comes to their lifespan regarding the imperial era. I believe it's been roughly around a decade, if not a bit longer than a decade. So their run was extraordinary Their run was extraordinarily long compared to girl groups on average, and they have substantial fan loyalty. When it comes to their weaknesses, their global penetration is weaker than the peak giants. We will see those in the upper two tiers. Their long term influence is still uncertain because they just ended. There hasn't been enough time for there to be girl group daughters that can say, I am inspired by Little Mix. What's this? There's not enough time for that to happen yet to see whether they will influence future girl groups or not. And their post breakup mythology is still developing as we speak. They could easily end up a level 2 group if future groups name them as an influence and their post breakup mythology keeps their legacy intact and their music becomes cross generational. But if not, they'll probably be a level 4 group. So Little Mix are currently in the historical waiting room. They may be a low level 5 or a level 4. It could be a 4A or a 4B. But the point is, time decides this. And the other group that I have in this sub tier is Fifth Harmony. So they ended some years before Little Mix. It has been almost a decade since they ended, but it hasn't been a decade yet. So the thing with Fifth Harmony is that they achieved huge visibility, but their long-term permanence became, and it still is, questionable. So with Fifth Harmony, they have major streaming era success since that was the era that they, as a group, came in, so they have to obviously accommodate to that. They have recognizable hits, they have a large fan base, and they have strong social media era relevance. And in addition to that, they were able to have mainstream hits. There were a lot of girl groups, and especially boy bands at the time, that they had a lot of internet fans, but they weren't mainstream, they weren't getting hits like that. So Fifth Harmony crossed that barrier. The thing with Fifth Harmony is that their internal instability essentially destroyed the group. Their solo career or the how it was built up, especially with Camilla, overshadowed the group. Their mythology is fragmentating, and it's been like that for years, and they have a weaker catalog cohesion. So their peak was real, but their permanence is kind of weakening, and it's weakened quickly. They also aren't the biggest girl group, especially compared to the ones that are above them. There have been some girl groups that came out after them, but I don't know if they've named Fifth Harmony as an influence. I don't know if it's still because they're still relatively recent. It's not like it's been like 20 or 30 years, and there's been future generations after them who could have came in and mentioned. But I do see Fifth Harmony moving to a level 4 group when it's all said and done. So now we are in level 6, and I like to call this the canon tier. So pretty much these are groups where the girl groups stop being merely successful acts and become a part of the permanent cultural institution of girl groups, or their permanent cultural institutions on their own. So these are the groups that permanently entered civilization. So these groups are canonized, historically stabilized, cross generational, globally or structurally influential, permanently embedded into pop memory. They are no longer fighting for permanence, they already won the battle. So, a level 6 group is historically inevitable. You cannot explain pop music, girl group history, youth culture, gendered pop branding, fandom evolution, or mainstream group dynamics without these groups. That is the key distinction. Okay, so for a while I didn't really have sub tiers for level 6, but I do have one now, and for 6A I'm calling it the Secure Canon Giants. So these are girl groups who are very influential. They created or helped create separate lanes for girl groups to go into. They each have their own lores and image and history, and they have songs that are pop cultural icon songs at this point and have crossed over generations. They're not the most influential group or the most standard group, and they might not be the most historical group when it comes to the foundation, but they helped start and pave different lanes for girl groups to go into. And for that, they definitely do deserve their credit, which is why I call this level 6A. Okay, so the first group that I have here are Salt and Peppa, and while there have been some female rap groups beforehand, none have broken out like Salt and Peppa have, where the others before them they might have had one hit or so, and that's really it. But with Salt and Peppa, they were able to expand who could succeed in mainstream music, especially for not only just female rappers, but different types of female girl groups and the type of genres of music that they can do. They had many songs, and they have many songs that endured cultural relevance and reached cross generational appeal, and they have a digital footprint due to these songs having such huge cultural importance. Their historical importance continues to rise decades after the imperial era. And you also see them as a bridge not only between rap and R&B, but they're kind of the baseline for what a group like TLC would eventually become. They really created their own lane. There are many other rap groups that came out after them, though to a lesser extent. And you really cannot talk about this lane of girl groups without Salt and Peppa, and they have really endured throughout the decades, which is why they're one of the titans of level 6. They normalized female rap in mainstream, essentially. They endured several hits and they represent cultural symbolism as well as attitude branding influence, which we will see a lot in later girl groups, despite them being less traditional in a lot of other ways. So the second group that I have in this tier is In Vogue. So one thing about In Vogue is that they were very praised for their musicianship, elegance, multi-era durability, consistency, and their genre blending. So they kind of took that from the Pointer Sisters in their own way and made it into something of their own. The whole purpose of In Vogue was to blend what was popular and notable of the 60s girl groups and merged into what was popular in the late 80s and early 90s and created their own flair about it. So they're a mix of the past and the present, and that became the baseline of what many groups did afterwards. They were very influential, even Little Mix reference being influenced by In Vogue. So I think that shows how long their reach is. In Vogue represented elite vocals, sophisticated branding with their dress code. They were very sophisticated, they were very elegant, they always made sure that they are top notch. They have strong crossover longevity, and enduring, critically respected catalog. I guess the weakness of them, which is why they are here and not in the top, is that compared to the top of the top, they do have less event scale, but they are a prestige group with prestige premiums and influence that cannot be taken away from them. Okay, so the next group that I have in this tier is the Sugar Babes. I think they're the highest UK or European group that I have here, regarding the examples that I am using for this video. So one thing that they have in their benefit is that they have a very strong UK prestige, and that crosses over into many other places in Europe as well. They are a critically respected girl group. They have catalog durability. For a girl group, they actually lasted a very long time. They have several hits, so they lasted a while for a girl group. In addition to all of that, I do believe that they went through a few lineup changes. If I am correct, I might be wrong about that. But compared to other girl groups, they have a lot of endurance and longevity when it comes to their mainstream run. So that's something that I do have to give them credit for. The main thing that has him here and not higher is that they do have a weaker global mythology. And when you're comparing them to the top of the top of the top, they kind of have to be here. And the final group that I do have in this sub tier, or in level 6A, are Girls' Generation. So apparently, while they're not the first K-pop girl group, They are seen as one of the most influential, as many of the later K-pop girl groups directly descend from their template and use them as a baseline influence. And with how big K-pop has gotten, especially over the last decade, I do think that is extremely important. So when you are the modern foundation or the foundation for modern K-pop girl groups, and they're doing very well right now, you definitely are lifted up in this higher level. And obviously, they have a major cultural impact throughout Asia, despite them not being the most crossover when it comes to international access themselves. So that's why they are here. Okay, so the next tier is level 6B, and I like to call this historical canon. So these are groups that are important to the foundation of the girl groups, so they helped out in the earlier eras of that era of the girl group, though they may not be the most standard version of the earlier form of the girl group. I hope that makes sense. They have a lot of success. Without them, you don't bridge the gap between eras, and you don't get the best of the girl groups within their eras. So that's why they're here, but they don't have the strongest lore or imprint or cross generational appeal compared to the groups that are in level 7. But chances are there isn't a level 7 without these groups to begin with. So their importance, they are successful, but they are not the first you think of when it comes to girl groups, though their importance is very well known and respected. Okay, so the first girl group that I have in this sub tier are the Shirelles. They are one of the earliest true girl group giants, so they had their run throughout the early 1960s when most girl groups really didn't have popularity like that. They really paved the way for most of the girl groups that came after them. They had a string of hit singles between them. They also bridged the doo-wop sound and the classical girl group sound. So they were the bridge to get to the Supremes, the Marvelettes, the Ronettes, and Martha and the Lindellas from the Andrew sisters like sound. So that's why they are very important. So they were more consistent than a group like the Marvelettes, but they, like the next group that I am going to talk about, didn't completely dominate the era like the Supremes did. They mainly sold singles where the albums didn't sell, and this was an era where albums didn't really sell like that, but it's why that they and the next group that I am going to reference are here, while the group above them is level 7. So the second and final group that I have as an example for what a level 6B is the group Martha and the Vandellas. So, in many ways, they are the bridge between the early girl groups who had more of that doo-wop sound of the late 50s and the early 60s to the modern pop soul girl groups that would be the Supremes and essentially everyone else that came after them. I do feel like they were the first group that Motown knew how to consistently market, and I mention consistently because the Marvelettes had success first, but Motown did not know how to consistently market them. I do feel like they got a lot more visibility from the company. They were on a lot more talk shows. They were a lot more mainstream, which is why their legacy has been able to be stabilized more in the modern day. A few of their songs are huge cultural staples, where a few of them, especially Dancing in the Street, was used for the civil rights movement that was happening in the time. They also had more of a rock sound compared to the other Motown female groups, and they're a bit grittier in that way. They're not at the top because they didn't get the same amount of focus, development, and they don't have the same lower or cultural imprint as the Supremes or the groups that are in level 7. But a level 6B is very good for them. So now we're at the final level, which is level 7. And I call this level overall the canon slash architectural core. So these are groups that define the entire system in itself. So level 7 is where your framework starts being just music history classification and starts becoming cultural architecture. These aren't just important girl groups, they are the reference points. Everything else regarding girl groups is measured against, so they are the standard. If you remove level 1 groups, the entire structure of girl group history collapses into something unrecognizable, bordering on nothingness. So, the core identity of level 7. So, these groups are globally defining, historically unavoidable, cross generational without effort, mythologized beyond music, that's a huge one, structurally influential on the industry in itself, and culturally embedded in everyday language, aesthetics, or identity. They don't just succeed in their era, they define eras that come well after them. So the difference between them and a level 6 is that level 6s are essential to pop history, but level 7 are essential to understanding culture itself. So there's a difference there. Level 7 groups are archetypes, symbols, shorthand references, and cultural default settings. People who don't even follow music often still know and reference them. And of course, like the other tiers in this video and the boy band levels of video, we are going to have sub-tiers for the level 7 groups. So the first sub-tier is 7A, and I am titling them the foundational slash historical architects. So essentially, the groups here are generally a lot older, and they are essentially the baseline for hugely successful girl groups. They help define what a girl group is in modern pop culture, and without them, it essentially doesn't really exist. Their DNA is essentially in every single group after them, and they are part of American culture beyond music. So they are the standard, they are the reference point, and they are really the first architects of the girl groups, really. Obviously, the first group that fits this sub-tier are the Supremes. They aren't just a girl group, though obviously they're here because they are the standard for girl groups and started damn near every single archetype that fits girl groups. The Supremes are also a cornerstone of Motown's global and pop culture breakthrough. They are one of the first black female groups to dominate mainstream pop in charts, in advertisements, in other avenues, in the magazines, and all that. They are a template for the modern girl group in itself. They represented an entire industrial era of pop production. They have movies and documentaries that are based off of them and Broadway plays. Obviously, I'm referring to Dreamgirl. Their harmonies, styling, and structure are essentially the DNA of many of the later girl groups, and you even have the standard of girl group member becoming a solo artist start here with Diana Ross. There has been so much media about the Supremes. Even 6 decades later, they have been heavily sampled. There are so many cultural teachings on them, documentaries, playlists, ecosystems, and they have survived several generations of reference. So they have held up over the decades. They change how groups are formed, how they are marketed, how they are styled, and how they are perceived culturally. So we even saw that even outside of nostalgia cycles, they remain active historically. So that is obviously why the Supremes are here. And the second group that I have here are the Andrew sisters. I could have split them up into two different tiers like I did with the boy band video where I had the historical foundation, and then I had the proto boy band. Obviously, for this video, it'll be proto girl group, but quite frankly, I didn't feel like doing all that, so I'm just going to combine them together. So here are the Andrew sisters. So essentially, they are a structural foundational group, but in a different branch of pop evolution than the Motown to modern girl group timeline. So that's why I kind of considered separating them and the Supremes into two different tiers. Anyway, so obviously level one because they defined the early group vocal identity. They helped normalize tight harmonic singing in pop formats, trio-based female vocal group structure, synchronized vocal delivery as entertainment, and this becomes part of the DNA later used by girl groups. The cultural saturation in their era was massive. So, like the Supremes, they were everywhere via radio, film, and touring circuits in ways that most girl groups just were not. But for the Andrews Sisters, it was during the World War II and post war America. Boogie Woogie Booga Boy is a cultural artifact, not just a song, and pretty much that is why they are here. They didn't shape modern girl groups branding the way that the Supremes do, but heck, even the Supremes were influenced by them, kind of indirectly. They even performed together with the Andrew Sisters, kind of passing on the torch towards the Supremes. So even that's kind of why they're relationship is interesting where they could be in the same sub tier, but if I really, really, really wanted to, I could separate them into two different sub tiers. And now we are at level 7B, and I call them the perfectors. So they obviously did not start girl groups, but they influenced all of the girl groups that came out after them and brought something new to the table in ways that changed girl groups forever. And they also just perfected what a girl group is. They all have global access and global appeal. They all have songs that are just beyond hit songs. They are cultural movements. They all have huge mythology and intrigue about them that goes far beyond their music, but the dynamics with one another and what they represent. Essentially, when you think of girl groups who had huge runs and sustained throughout the generations when it comes to their cultural impact, influence, imagery, and just recognition, these are the three groups that come up. So let's talk about each of the groups. So the first group that I'm going to be discussing in this final sub-tier are the Spice Girls. So when it comes to the Spice Girls, they are the clearest example of pop culture as ideology. They didn't just dominate music, they defined a cultural language, which definitely changed how music throughout the late 90s ended up being. So, girl power became a global phrase mainly due to the Spice Girls. Each member became an archetype, like Sport, Tea Spice, Posh Spice, Baby Spice, etc. So that became a huge part of their branding and other girl groups. Not to the same extent, but they also marketed their girl groups within this archetype, though through different exaggerations of it. They turned branding into an identity mythology where they were everywhere for the few years that they were at the top. They became a merchandising and a media empire, so this kind of ties into their branding there. And they function as a cultural reference point even outside of music discussions, which is still the case damn near 30 years later. They are obviously still remembered for their music, and Wannabe especially is a cultural pop culture moment over 30 years later. But they are also remembered because they became cultural characters within themselves. So that's why the Spice Girls are here, and they are still the best selling girl group at the moment. So that could change if other groups updated their verifications, and that could just change in the future. But they're always going to be seen as one of the prototypes or the perfections of the girl group. So the second group that is in this subtier are Destiny's Child. So essentially, in a lot of ways, they are the modern blueprint of the global girl group excellence. So in one way, you have a lot of girl groups that came after them say, oh, this is going to be the Beyonce of the group. So that in itself became the standard. It was Diana Ross in the past, but now that reference point and that archetype is the Beyonce. Obviously, they are seen as the perfecters of the one lead singer archetype of the girl groups. They helped define 2000s R&B and pop hybrid dominance as they were both mainstream pop, but they also had a solid R&B fan base in ways that a lot of other girl groups just did not have at the time. They established and they upped the modern performance standards for girl groups when it comes to live vocals and dancing in ways that even Spice Girls and TLC just does not have. Obviously, it became a launchpad for Beyonce's global mythos and her solo career, so that's a whole nother thing in itself. They also influenced group structure, branding, and vocal hierarchy expectations. Obviously, they helped with the staccato rapping becoming more popularized with pop singers who aren't rappers. So essentially, Destiny's Child are the model that many little girl groups, and heck, even some girl groups who came out before them, are measured against, even unconsciously. So, in a lot of ways, Destiny's Child is the standard girl group, and the one that is always has the comparisons made against. So, the final girl group, not only just in this sub tier, but this tier, but just in general that I'm going to be talking about today is TLC. So they occupy a very rare space regarding their musical canon, cultural accessibility, and enduring relevance. And even just in general, they are one of the few girl groups who perfectly combines rap, hip hop, pop, and R&B in the music. The fact that they have one rapper and two singers in their group alone just makes them very unique, and they bring that differentiation to the table when it comes to girl groups. So they obviously had massive 90s dominance across pop and R&B formats and audiences. They had very strong visual identity when it comes to their fashion, aesthetics, messaging, and connecting that all together. And the interesting thing about TLC is that they continuously reinvent themselves with every single era in ways that most girl groups just do not have, while not losing the essence of their main visual identity and branding. So that's very interesting. They also have a lot of socially relevant lyrical content that is not very common amongst girl groups, which makes them stand out. They, like the Spice Girls, Destiny's Child, and even some of the other girl groups I mentioned below, have cross generational streaming survival and cross generational referencing and audience appeal. And they are a constant cultural reference presence. So when you look at TLC, they are one of the most complete girl groups ever, though they might not be as mythologized as the Spice Girls or Destiny's Child. Even that is very, very debatable. Okay, that concludes my 7 levels of girl groups video. It was definitely interesting looking at all of these girl groups from the distant past, the recent past, and the current day to kind of compare and contrast to see how their legacies have held up well after the imperial eras have ended. And obviously, I had to take into account current groups, though I did kind of predict where they would probably end up once everything's said and done. But obviously, you don't know that until it's done. So this was a very fun thing to do. I might do some more 7 levels of things for other elements of the music industry. I don't know what. But either way, this was very, very, very fun. I'm most likely going to do a 7 levels of male R&B groups and female R&B groups in the future. That will be very interesting. But otherwise, yeah. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more soon. Take care.